When a modest teacher's devotion to his struggling students captured Barron Trump's attention, no one could have guessed how drastically one act of kindness would change all their lives. This story begins in the early hours of a Friday, on a peaceful campus in Palm Beach. You'll soon learn how a teacher's quiet dedication intersected with an unexpected force of empathy, setting in motion an unforgettable chain of events. He arrived every morning before sunrise, parking his faded blue sedan in the far corner of Oxbridge Academy's lot, as if it were an unspoken rule that his shabby car shouldn't mingle with newer, sleeker models. Marcus Martin, commonly referred to by students as Mr. M, was not the typical teacher you'd find at a prestigious private school like Oxbridge. He wore the same pair of well-pressed but clearly worn trousers day after day, rotating between a handful of button-down shirts that were meticulously cared for, but beginning to fray at the edges. Though the institution stood as a bastion of wealth and privilege, Mr. Martin's background was anything but. He'd grown up in a tiny Florida town marked by rows of dilapidated houses, and even now, money was tight. Teaching had never been a pathway to financial riches, yet he'd chosen it wholeheartedly, compelled by a calling deeper than any paycheck could satisfy. By the time most faculty pulled into the lot with coffee cups in hand, Mr. Martin had already unlocked the dusty old track shed, checked that the math lab was ready for the day's lessons, and sorted the reams of papers he'd been grading since dawn. In a school known for its lavish resources, Mr. Martin managed, with quiet determination, to stand out for entirely different reasons. The campus bustled with students carrying designer backpacks and wearing the latest shoes, but he remained something of a fixture on the sidelines, never the center of attention, always there when you needed him. The students might not have paid him much mind initially. He was just that teacher in the corner, the one who coached the after-school study club, or supervised the library on weekends so students could prepare for upcoming tests. Even so, there was a comforting quality in his presence. If someone missed lunch or didn't have enough money for the cafeteria, he'd discreetly slide an extra sandwich across the table. Whenever a student struggled with geometry or an essay topic confused them, he'd show up at their desk after class, offering gentle but clear guidance. Some days, a quiet, "Thanks, Mr. M," was all he received in return. Other days, he got nothing. It never seemed to bother him. For Mr. Martin, teaching wasn't about the applause or grand gestures. It was about doing what he believed was right. But that morning, as he prepared his usual lesson plans, something changed. A student slipped into the classroom before the first bell even rang. Barron Trump, known mostly by name and recognized for a certain family legacy, walked in silently. Though he carried the same uniform as everyone else, a navy blazer with the Oxbridge crest, khaki pants pressed to perfection, Barron's air was different. Polite, yes, but also reserved, as though he was an observer in a realm full of noise. He was there to see Mr. Martin, though the teacher didn't realize it at first. "Good morning, Mr. Martin," Barron said softly, placing a thick notebook on the desk. "I was hoping you could help me with a project." Mr. Martin looked up from a stack of quizzes he was grading, eyebrows raised. "Sure, Barron, have a seat." It wasn't often that Barron reached out. He preferred to solve problems quietly or ask for help only when absolutely necessary. But over the last few weeks, he'd watched Mr. Martin. He'd watched how the teacher used his free periods to help students who had nowhere else to turn. He'd watched him repair broken desk chairs, rummaging through the storeroom for spare parts because he didn't want the school to spend money it didn't have to. He'd watched him press a $5 bill into a distraught student's hand, telling the student to eat lunch and pay him back whenever they could, knowing full well that they probably never would. And for a brief moment, Barron had caught a glimpse of Mr. Martin's face when he thought no one was looking, a look of resigned fatigue that appeared when he juggled all his responsibilities with only minimal resources. All these observations kindled something in Barron, an awareness that extended beyond the typical teenage concerns of grades and social circles. He couldn't stop thinking about it. While many teachers at Oxbridge Academy were well compensated, driving luxury cars and wearing designer clothes, Mr. Martin's threadbare shirts and battered sedan told a different story. How was he surviving on a meager teacher's salary in a place as expensive as Palm Beach County? Barron had no idea. Yet a nagging instinct told him that Mr. Martin might need a helping hand. What he didn't expect was how momentous that realization would become. As Barron opened his notebook, discussing an advanced math assignment that he claimed was giving him trouble, Mr. Martin patiently explained each step. But in Barron's mind, his real question wasn't about algebra, it was about this man's life. For a moment, Barron hesitated to ask anything personal. Maybe it wasn't his place. Still, a seed of curiosity compelled him forward. "Thank you," Barron said once Mr. Martin had walked him through the solution. "Hey, do you have a minute?" "Of course," Mr. Martin answered, setting aside the papers. Barron frowned slightly, trying to find the right words. "I see you work a lot of extra hours. I mean, you're always here. Do you ever get a break?" Mr. Martin's eyes flickered with surprise. Most kids asked about tests or grades, not about his well-being. "I manage," he said simply, offering a slight smile. "There's always more to be done, especially for those who need help." Barron nodded slowly. "Is it tough, though? Balancing so much, I mean." There was a moment of hesitation before Mr. Martin replied, "Sometimes, but everyone has struggles. Mine aren't any more special than anyone else's." Barron opened his mouth to say more, but the bell rang, signaling the start of classes. With a nod and a parting smile, Mr. Martin grabbed his stack of papers and made his way into the hallway to greet incoming students. Barron watched him go, the question still forming in his mind. How do you find the strength to keep going when the world seems stacked against you? He didn't know it then, but that was the moment something big began to unfold. Later that week, as Barron sat in the campus garden behind the main academic building, he thought about what he'd witnessed. Day in and day out, Mr. Martin did the type of work that rarely earned accolades. If students succeeded, the spotlight shone on them, or perhaps on the school's resources. If they failed, more responsibility heaped onto Mr. Martin's shoulders, even though he was already doing everything he could. It felt fundamentally unfair to Barron that a man who invested so much love and effort into his students would do so under the cloud of financial stress. At home that evening, Barron mentioned Mr. Martin during dinner, weaving the story into casual conversation as if testing how his parents might react. He spoke of how Mr. Martin stayed late tutoring those who couldn't keep up, how he spent his own money on classroom supplies, and how he drove a battered sedan that seemed on the verge of collapse. It struck a chord, particularly with his mother, who believed strongly in recognizing silent contributors. "Have you considered helping him?" she asked gently, setting down her fork. Her tone carried no judgment, only warmth. Barron shrugged. "I want to, but I don't know how." His father, a man known for grand gestures but also for teaching Barron the value of thoughtful action, looked over with an encouraging nod. "Think about what would mean the most to him. It's not always about spending money. Sometimes it's about involving others, giving them a chance to show appreciation." That night, Barron drafted a plan. He wanted it to remain a secret until the right moment, so he approached a handful of trusted peers and a few teachers known for their generosity. At first, the idea seemed too big. Buy a reliable car for Mr. Martin, raise enough funds to pay off some of his debts, start a scholarship, or set up an emergency fund. The possibilities were endless. Yet Barron knew the final outcome had to be both personal and immediate. Mr. Martin's old sedan was on its last legs. A reliable vehicle would change his life on the most basic level, ensuring he could drive to school without fear of breaking down, pick up supplies for his classes, and maybe even take a day trip with his own family when he had the chance. Within days, a small circle of students and faculty convened in a quiet corner of the library. They shared stories of Mr. Martin's empathy and dedication, how he'd once spent hours after school helping a student master a difficult language concept, how he returned a lost wallet to another student's parents, filled with the exact cash and cards, refusing any sort of reward. Whispers of these small acts had circulated for years, yet no one had thought to repay Mr. Martin's kindness in a collective way. By the end of the meeting, everyone was determined to make a difference. Funds trickled in at first. Some seniors emptied their part-time job savings, explaining how Mr. Martin had rescued them from near-failing grades. A teacher offered proceeds from a bake sale. Another pledged a portion of their annual bonus. Little by little, the total began to climb. Barron's parents discreetly contributed a significant amount, but Barron insisted the effort shouldn't hinge on his name or family. He wanted every contribution, no matter how small, to matter. This was about uniting people in gratitude, reminding them that genuine kindness is a two-way street. Meanwhile, Mr. Martin carried on unaware. Each morning he arrived before sunrise, polished his lesson plans, and did the tasks that few others noticed. Each night he left after sunset, sinking into his worn driver's seat and hoping his car would make it another day. He had no inkling that an extraordinary surprise was building behind the scenes. Barron and his covert group decided that the upcoming school assembly, meant to celebrate various academic and extracurricular achievements, would be the ideal moment. The headmaster, who admired Mr. Martin's diligence, agreed to cooperate. The plan was straightforward. Partway through the ceremony, They would transition to a special presentation and call Mr. Martin onto the stage. Then, in front of the entire student body, they would unveil the gift, a sparkling, gently used yet impeccably maintained sedan, meticulously chosen to ensure it was both reliable and modest enough for Mr. Martin's sense of humility. As the big day neared, excitement rippled through the campus. Students could barely contain themselves, exchanging knowing smiles whenever Mr. Martin passed by. Teachers whispered in break rooms, rehearsing their roles in the surprise. Even the maintenance staff, who'd formed a quiet camaraderie with Mr. Martin, pitched in with small contributions and heartfelt notes of thanks. Every hallway conversation seemed to revolve around the impending reveal, always careful to pause whenever Mr. Martin happened to be in earshot. One afternoon, as Barron roamed the halls, he spotted Mr. Martin carrying a stack of old textbooks, brow creased with concern. "Barron, could you help me for a second?" he asked, shifting the weight to one arm. Barron obliged, relieving him of half the load. They walked together in companionable silence. "Thank you," Mr. Martin said, exhaling as they reached the library. "We got these new editions, so I'm retiring the old ones, just trying to make sure the new books are ready for class tomorrow." He placed them on a shelf. "Never enough hours in the day, but we do what we can, right?" Barron smiled, nodding. "It seems like you do a lot more than most, Mr. Martin." For a flicker of a moment, Mr. Martin's face showed something akin to exhaustion, but it vanished under a practiced smile. "I love teaching. It's not about the hours. It's about the kids. My job is to help them learn and grow. Everything else is secondary." Barron felt a surge of admiration, but he kept his thoughts to himself. Instead, he simply said, "I really appreciate that," before heading to his next class. As he disappeared around the corner, he couldn't help but think, "Soon, we'll show you how much that dedication means." The morning of the assembly arrived, crisp and bright. Students poured into the auditorium, the hum of excited chatter filling the air. Barron stood backstage with a small cluster of accomplices. His pulse thudded in his ears and his fingers felt clammy. While the rest of the school believed they were there to celebrate a few academic milestones, a handful of them knew a major surprise was in store. "Relax," said one of his classmates, nudging him. "We've got this." Barron took a deep breath. Standing off to the side was the headmaster, flipping through a note card that read "Special Presentation" at the top. Over near the back entrance of the auditorium, Mr. Martin wandered in, looking slightly puzzled by the unusually large crowd. The entire student body, from freshmen to seniors, was in attendance, along with teachers, staff, and a few parents who had quietly been invited to witness the event. After a series of short speeches from the debate team, the math club, and a report on the upcoming sports tournaments, the headmaster stepped up to the lectern, clearing his throat. "Good morning, Oxbridge Academy," he began. "We have celebrated academic excellence today. Now, however, we turn our attention to a different kind of excellence, the excellence of character." A hush fell over the auditorium. Curiosity piqued. Mr. Martin, seated near the back, leaned forward slightly, wondering what was coming next. "I'd like to invite Barron Trump to the stage," the headmaster announced, smiling at Barron. "He has something to share on behalf of our school community." The applause was polite, though uncertain. Most of the crowd had no idea what to expect. Barron made his way to the microphone, heart pounding. He looked out at the sea of faces, students, teachers, staff, all waiting. He drew in a deep breath, reminding himself of the reason behind this moment. "Hello, everyone," he began, voice slightly shaky. "We're here today because there's someone in our midst who embodies the true spirit of kindness and dedication. Someone who works tirelessly for our success, often without recognition or thanks. I'm talking about Mr. Marcus Martin." At the mention of his name, Mr. Martin's eyebrows shot up. A ripple of murmurs filled the auditorium. Some students began clapping, others looked around with curiosity. Barron forged ahead. "For years, Mr. Martin has arrived before dawn and stayed well past sunset," Barron said. "He's used his own money to buy supplies, given his free time to tutor those who needed extra help, and most importantly, shown us all what compassion looks like in action. Even though this is a school where many have a lot, Mr. Martin has always given so much of himself, even when he didn't have much to give." Now the applause grew louder, and Mr. Martin turned crimson. He looked around as if checking whether someone else was behind him, but it was clear he was the reason for this assembly, or at least for this part of it. Barron continued, "A few of us got together and realized we needed to do something to thank him, but not just with words. We decided to take real action." He gestured toward a side entrance where a set of double doors suddenly opened. Through it rolled a sleek, gently used silver sedan with a giant blue bow on the hood. The crowd gasped, necks craning to get a better look. Mr. Martin's mouth fell open. The color drained from his face, replaced by an expression of total disbelief. Applause erupted through the auditorium, evolving into a thunderous standing ovation. Some students jumped to their feet, clapping wildly. Teachers blinked back tears. Barron held up a set of keys. "Mr. Martin," he said, his voice echoing in the hushed awe. "This is from all of us, the students, the teachers, the staff, everyone you've touched with your kindness. We hope this car will make your life a little bit easier, so you can keep doing what you do best, inspiring us to be better." With that, he stepped away from the mic. The crowd's cheers swelled, and the headmaster beckoned Mr. Martin to come forward. Frozen, Mr. Martin managed to stand, though his legs seemed to wobble. He walked slowly down the aisle, and students reached out to pat him on the shoulder or shake his hand as he passed. Tears gleamed in his eyes, and he made no effort to hide them. This was a moment of raw emotion, of vulnerability. When he finally reached the stage, Barron extended the keys. Mr. Martin stared at them, blinking away tears. I can't believe this," he stammered, his voice quivering. "I never expected anything like this." A wave of laughter and applause broke out, gentle and kind. Barron put a reassuring hand on Mr. Martin's shoulder. "We all believe in you, Mr. Martin. You've given us so much. We wanted to give something back." Mr. Martin took the keys, still in disbelief. The cheering crowd was now on its feet, roaring with approval. He stepped up to the microphone, face flushed, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I don't know what to say," he began, voice trembling. "I've always tried to do my best, not for recognition, but because I love teaching. To see all of you come together like this, I'm truly speechless." He paused, swallowing hard. "This means more than you know," he continued. "I've had moments when I thought I might not be able to keep going, but every time I felt that way, one of you, one of my students or a fellow teacher, would do something small that reminded me why I do this. And now, seeing this, I promise I'll use this gift to keep giving back. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart." The applause returned, even louder than before. Some teachers hugged each other. Students captured the moment on their phones. The entire auditorium bristled with an electric sense of unity. In that singular instance, differences in social circles or backgrounds seemed to vanish, replaced by the realization that compassion could bridge any gap. At the back of the auditorium, a maintenance worker dabbed his eyes with a handkerchief. A math teacher, known for her rigid demeanor, quietly blew her nose, smiling through tears. Students who seldom interacted found themselves locked in a collective awe. For Barron, it was a moment that soared beyond satisfaction. He felt an indescribable warmth in seeing the transformation on Mr. Martin's face, a man usually weighed down by the daily burdens of an underpaid teacher, now uplifted by a wave of gratitude so vast it nearly swept him off his feet. After the assembly, a steady stream of people approached the stage to congratulate Mr. Martin. They shared stories of how he'd helped them through rough patches or thanked him for going the extra mile. Parents, staff, and even members of the board expressed admiration. Through it all, Mr. Martin remained humble, his eyes still wet with happy tears. Barron lingered near the stage, and eventually Mr. Martin found him. Wordlessly, the teacher pulled him into a hug. It was a moment that spoke louder than any speech. Barron, taken aback, returned the embrace. Though Mr. Martin's thank you was heartfelt, Barron understood that gratitude flowed both ways. He might have orchestrated the gift, but Mr. Martin was the one who'd given them all a lesson in compassion and perseverance, day after day. The news spread rapidly. Clips of the assembly circulated on social media, featuring the reveal of the silver sedan with the giant bow and Mr. Martin's tearful reaction. Viewers from across the country were moved by the story of a tight-knit school community rallying around a devoted teacher. Some alumni even reached out to see how they could contribute to Mr. Martin's newfound security or to an emergency fund for other underpaid educators. But despite the outside interest, none of that really mattered to Mr. Martin. Standing by his new car in the parking lot that afternoon, he was more overwhelmed by the generosity of those right in front of him. A throng of students surrounded him, clamoring to get a closer look. The car itself was nothing overly extravagant, just a well-maintained, late-model sedan with good mileage and a reliable engine. But to Mr. Martin, it glistened like a rare treasure, symbolizing a wave of compassion he'd never imagined he'd be on the receiving end of. Barron, hands jammed into his pockets, approached quietly. "We hope this helps," he said. Mr. Martin turned, keys clutched tightly in one hand as though he was afraid it might vanish if he relaxed his grip. "I still can't believe it," he replied. You've given me more than just a car. You've given me hope." Barron's gaze shifted to the ground momentarily, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "I think you gave us hope first," he said softly. "We just figured it was time we did something about it." Wordless, Mr. Martin nodded. The magnitude of that day pressed down on him in the best possible way. His mind replayed years of small, hidden sacrifices, turning down dinners out so he could afford school supplies, skipping vacations to offer extra tutoring sessions, patching up his old sedan countless times instead of replacing it. Those moments had passed quietly, never recognized. Now, in one incredible gesture, the entire school community had validated his life's work. For Barron, the day offered a realization. Real change doesn't require universal consensus or a massive team from the start. Sometimes all it takes is one person noticing, then gathering a small group with the same heart. It's a spark that, given the right conditions, ignites a fire of compassion that can light up the entire school, or even beyond. Mr. Martin took a deep breath, looking across the parking lot at the line of luxury cars. His old sedan sat in the far corner, battered but still standing. He felt a pang of sentimental attachment. That car had carried him through tough times. But today, he welcomed a new chapter, courtesy of the young people he'd devoted his life to teaching. He walked over, popped open the trunk of the new sedan, and gently placed his worn-out briefcase inside. It felt symbolic, letting go of struggles so heavily tied to unreliable transport and stepping into a future that promised a bit more security. Students and teachers milled around, snapping photos, sharing laughter, and wiping away the last of their tears. The assembly might have ended, but the sense of unity lingered. As the day wound down, Mr. Martin found a quiet moment to call his mother and share the news. She wept, overwhelmed by the school's kindness. He then texted a photo of the car to a few close friends who knew how hard he'd struggled. The phone buzzed back almost immediately with excited messages of congratulations and praise. Barron watched from a short distance, allowing Mr. Martin the space to revel in what had just happened. He marveled at how the teacher's face glowed with a profound joy. In a sense, Barron felt that Mr. Martin had taught them all a lesson without even intending to. Real compassion can ripple across a community in ways no one can foresee. It only takes one person to stand up and say, "Let's do something good." When the last bell rang, Mr. Martin took a moment to sit behind the wheel of his new sedan, adjusting the seat and mirrors. The engine purred to life in a way his old clunker never had. He ran his hand across the dashboard, a small, grateful smile forming. This was more than a means of transport. It was validation, a sign that he was seen, appreciated, and recognized. For years, he'd battled feelings of inadequacy. He worried about not making enough money, not providing the best for his own family, not measuring up in a school of affluence. But in that moment, those worries lifted, replaced by a warmth that told him, "You matter here." He spotted Barron at the edge of the lot, carrying a heavy backpack, likely heading off to meet his driver or ride home. Mr. Martin rolled down the window and waved him over. Barron approached, a questioning look on his face. "Hop in," Mr. Martin said, motioning to the passenger seat. "I'll drop you off wherever you need to go." Barron's eyes widened a little, then he broke into a grin. "Sure," he said, climbing in. The interior still smelled faintly of new leather conditioner. "Feels good, right?" Mr. Martin laughed, nodding enthusiastically as he pulled out of the parking space. "You have no idea." They drove in comfortable silence for a few blocks, passing the manicured lawns and grand gates that lined the roads near Oxbridge Academy. Finally, Mr. Martin spoke. "I want you to know," he said, "that what you did, what all of you did, has changed my life." Barron turned to look at him. "We were just returning the kindness you've shown us." Mr. Martin's grip on the wheel tightened slightly, and his voice grew softer. "I didn't do anything special. I just tried to be there for the students who needed me." Barron's gaze drifted out the window. "But that's what makes it special, Mr. Martin. You never asked for anything in return." They reached a quiet side street near where Barron's father's driver usually waited. Mr. Martin parked, and for a moment neither spoke. Finally, Barron unbuckled his seatbelt. "Thank you for the ride," he said, smiling. "And thank you for everything else, too. The tutoring, the advice, just everything." Mr. Martin nodded, eyes glistening but not shedding tears this time. "Thank you, Barron. I'll see you Monday." Barron stepped out, and Mr. Martin watched him walk away before merging back onto the main road. As he drove home in his new car, a tangible expression of the school's gratitude, he silently resolved to continue doing exactly what he'd always done. Only now, He would carry within him the knowledge that no act of kindness goes entirely unnoticed. Eventually, someone, somewhere, will pay it forward.